October 2014. The autumn rain drummed against the weathered windows of the Richmond Community Church as construction workers prepared to renovate the century-old building. What should have been a routine morning of demolition work transformed into something far more sinister when contractor Mike Henderson discovered a hidden compartment behind the office wall. Inside lay a manila envelope containing financial receipts spanning decades, but it was the notation in faded blue ink that would resurrect a case that had haunted the faithful community for over 6 decades. The handwriting belonged to Dorothy Mae Richardson, the church treasurer who had vanished without a trace in 1953, leaving behind only questions and a congregation shattered by the inexplicable disappearance of one of their most devoted members. The discovery sent ripples through the tight-knit community that had long since accepted Dorothy's fate as an unsolved mystery. Detective Sarah Williams, who had recently transferred to Richmond's cold case unit, found herself staring at evidence that had been literally buried within the walls of the very place where Dorothy had spent her final known hours. The receipts told a story of financial discrepancies that investigators in 1953 had never uncovered, hidden away by someone who clearly understood their significance. As news of the discovery spread through Richmond's aging population, longtime residents who remembered Dorothy began to emerge with stories they had kept buried for decades. Henderson, a third-generation contractor whose grandfather had actually worked on the church's original construction, described the moment of discovery with startling clarity. He had been removing old plaster when his crowbar hit something hollow behind the wall. The compartment was deliberately constructed, not a random hiding place, and the envelope was wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture and time. The receipts inside documented cash transactions that didn't appear in any of the church's official financial records, suggesting a systematic pattern of embezzlement that had gone undetected for years before Dorothy's disappearance. The implications were staggering for a community that had canonized Dorothy's memory over the decades. Here was evidence suggesting that the woman they remembered as the epitome of Christian virtue might have been living a double life, stealing from the very congregation that trusted her implicitly. But as Detective Williams would soon discover, the story was far more complex and disturbing than a simple case of embezzlement gone wrong. If you're fascinated by cases where decades-old evidence completely transforms our understanding of seemingly straightforward disappearances, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for the details that mainstream coverage always seems to miss. Dorothy Mae Richardson was born on March 15, 1918, in the small farming community of Millerville just outside Richmond. Standing 5 feet 8 inches tall, with shoulder-length auburn hair that caught the light when she moved, Dorothy possessed striking hazel eyes that seemed to change color depending on her mood and the clothes she wore. Her slender frame carried itself with the confident posture of someone accustomed to being noticed, and she had a distinctive habit of tucking her hair behind her left ear when she was thinking deeply about something. The daughter of Harold and Margaret Richardson, Dorothy grew up in a household where faith and hard work were considered equally important virtues. Harold operated a successful grain elevator business that served farms throughout the county, while Margaret taught Sunday school at the Methodist Church and organized charity drives for families struggling during the Depression. Dorothy's younger brother, James, followed their father into the grain business, but Dorothy had always been drawn to numbers and organization in ways that set her apart from other young women of her era. Those who knew Dorothy during her youth remembered her as exceptionally bright and detail-oriented, with an almost obsessive need to ensure everything was properly documented and accounted for. Mary Catherine Phillips, Dorothy's childhood friend who was still alive at the time of the discovery, recalled that Dorothy could balance a ledger faster than anyone I ever knew. She had this gift for seeing patterns in numbers that the rest of us missed. Even as teenagers, she was helping local businesses organize their bookkeeping. Another longtime friend, Ruth Henderson, described Dorothy as intensely loyal, but also intensely private. She had this way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the world when she was talking to you, but she never really let anyone get too close to the real Dorothy. By 1950, Dorothy had established herself as an indispensable member of Richmond Community Church. She had moved to town after completing a business course at the county seat, and her reputation for financial acumen quickly made her a valuable volunteer. The church's previous treasurer, elderly Thomas Morrison, had recommended Dorothy as his successor, praising her meticulous attention to detail and her innovative ideas for tracking donations and expenses. Pastor William Hayes, who had hired Dorothy for her position, would later tell investigators that she had transformed the church's chaotic financial records into a model of organization and transparency. Dorothy lived alone in a tidy apartment above Carson's General Store on Main Street, maintaining what neighbors described as an almost ritualistic daily routine. She would arrive at the church office by 7 each morning, spending 2 hours reviewing financial records before the day's regular activities began. Her evenings were devoted to correspondence with church members about financial matters and preparation for the weekly financial reports she presented to the congregation every Sunday. Richmond in the early 1950s was a community of approximately 3,000 residents, most of whom earned their living through agriculture or the small businesses that supported the farming economy. The town had emerged from World War II with a sense of optimism and growth, as returning veterans settled down to raise families and build careers in the stable, familiar environment of rural America. The community was overwhelmingly Methodist and Baptist, with Richmond Community Church serving as the largest and most influential congregation in the area. The church itself had been built in 1887 and served not just as a place of worship, but as the unofficial center of community social life. Church suppers, charity drives, youth programs, and community meetings all took place within its walls. The congregation took enormous pride in their financial stability and their ability to support both local charitable causes and foreign missions. This prosperity was largely attributed to Dorothy's careful stewardship of church resources and her innovative fundraising ideas. Main Street in 1953 was lined with thriving businesses that reflected the town's agricultural prosperity. Carson's General Store occupied the largest building, selling everything from farm equipment to ladies' hats. Palmer's Pharmacy featured a soda fountain that served as an informal gathering place for teenagers and young adults. The Richmond Bank, housed in an impressive brick building that had been constructed just before the war, handled the financial needs of farmers throughout the county. Dr. Kenneth Morrison operated his medical practice from a converted house near the center of town, while the volunteer fire department occupied a building that also served as the community meeting hall. The social fabric of Richmond was tightly woven, with most residents belonging to extended networks of family and church relationships that had developed over generations. Everyone knew their neighbor's business, and unusual behavior or unexplained absences were quickly noticed and discussed. This made Dorothy's eventual disappearance all the more shocking, because it occurred despite the community's assumption that nothing significant could happen without multiple witnesses and immediate detection. The last day anyone saw Dorothy alive was Sunday, November 8, 1953, a crisp autumn morning when she followed her usual routine with what appeared to be normal precision. At 6:45 a.m., Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who lived in the apartment below Dorothy's, heard her moving around upstairs, preparing for what everyone expected would be another ordinary day. Dorothy's routine was so consistent that neighbors had learned to set their clocks by her movements, and nothing about that morning suggested anything unusual was about to occur. At 7:15 a.m., Dorothy arrived at the church office, carrying her usual leather briefcase and wearing her best blue dress with the small pearl buttons that she reserved for Sundays. Janitor Frank Morrison, who was sweeping the front steps, later told police that Dorothy had seemed perfectly normal and had even commented on the beautiful fall weather. She unlocked the office door and immediately began her customary review of the previous week's financial records, a process that typically took her exactly 90 minutes to complete. At 8:45 a.m., Dorothy emerged from the office to greet early arrivals for Sunday school, including several children whose parents appreciated her patient help with their arithmetic lessons. Susan Palmer, who was 8 years old at the time, remembered that Dorothy had praised her work on a particularly challenging math problem and had promised to show her a new technique for long division the following week. This interaction was significant because it suggested Dorothy was making plans for the future and had no indication that this would be her final day. At 9:30 a.m., Dorothy took her usual seat in the front pew during Sunday school, actively participating in a discussion about stewardship and Christian responsibility. Teacher Margaret Williams later recalled that Dorothy had been particularly engaged in the lesson, offering insights about how the church could better manage its resources to serve the community's needs. Dorothy's comments during this discussion would later take on eerie significance, as they suggested she had been thinking deeply about financial responsibility and moral obligations. At 10:45 a.m., regular church services began with Dorothy playing her customary role in collecting and organizing the morning's offerings. She moved through the sanctuary with her characteristic efficiency, ensuring that each collection plate was properly counted and secured before services ended. Pastor Hayes noted that Dorothy had seemed particularly meticulous that morning, double-checking calculations that she normally completed with casual confidence. At 12:15 p.m., Dorothy presented her weekly financial report to the congregation, detailing income, expenses, and the church's current financial position. Her presentation was thorough and well received, with several members commenting on the church's continued prosperity under her careful management. The report would later be scrutinized by investigators who found no obvious discrepancies or signs of the problems that the hidden receipts would eventually reveal. At 1:30 p.m., Dorothy attended the traditional post-service coffee hour in the church basement, chatting with various congregation members about upcoming events and financial planning for the church's Christmas programs. Several people remembered her discussing plans for a special fundraising dinner that would require careful coordination between the various church committees. At 2:45 p.m., Dorothy was last seen leaving the church building, carrying her briefcase and telling Pastor Hayes that she planned to spend the afternoon reviewing some financial records at home. This was her normal Sunday routine, and nothing about her demeanor or conversation suggested that anything was amiss. She walked down Main Street toward her apartment, waving to neighbors and stopping briefly to admire Mrs. Henderson's chrysanthemums, which were at their peak autumn beauty. The discovery of Dorothy's absence began gradually, as was typical in a community where people maintained regular routines and noticed deviations quickly. When Dorothy failed to appear for her usual Monday morning arrival at the church office, Pastor Hayes initially assumed she might be dealing with a minor illness or family emergency. However, when she hadn't appeared by 10 o'clock, he decided to check on her welfare by visiting her apartment above Carson's store. Store owner Robert Carson accompanied Pastor Hayes upstairs, using his master key to enter Dorothy's apartment when repeated knocking produced no response. What they found was a scene of eerie normalcy that would puzzle investigators for decades to come. Dorothy's apartment was immaculately organized, with no signs of struggle, hurried departure, or foul play. Her bed was neatly made, her clothes were properly arranged in the closet, and her personal belongings appeared untouched. The kitchen table held a partially completed letter to her brother James, discussing routine family matters and mentioning her plans to visit for Christmas. A cup of tea sat on the counter, still containing cold liquid that suggested Dorothy had been interrupted while drinking it. Her purse was missing, along with the clothes she had been wearing when last seen, but everything else remained exactly as neighbors expected to find it. Detective Robert Chen, who was Richmond's only full-time investigator in 1953, arrived at the scene by noon and immediately recognized the unusual nature of Dorothy's disappearance. The complete absence of evidence suggesting either planned departure or violent crime presented challenges that would prove insurmountable with the investigative tools available at the time. Chen methodically documented everything in Dorothy's apartment, but the scene offered no obvious clues about what might have happened to her. How often do you think about how different your own daily routine is from people living 70 years ago, and how those differences might affect the way disappearances are investigated and solved today? The initial investigation into Dorothy's disappearance revealed a network of relationships and potential motives that complicated what might otherwise have been a straightforward missing person case. Richmond's small size meant that everyone knew everyone else's business, but it also meant that people were reluctant to share information that might cast suspicion on their neighbors and friends. Pastor William Hayes became the first person investigators examined closely, not because he was considered a serious suspect, but because his position gave him more access to Dorothy and the church finances than anyone else in the community. Hayes was 42 years old at the time of Dorothy's disappearance and had been serving Richmond Community Church for 8 years. Investigators discovered that he had occasionally disagreed with Dorothy about financial policies, particularly her insistence on detailed documentation for every expenditure, no matter how small. Hayes provided a detailed account of his movements on the Sunday Dorothy disappeared, including multiple witnesses who could verify his presence at various church functions throughout the day. His wife Martha confirmed that he had been home all Sunday evening, working on his sermon for the following week. The investigation into Hayes concluded that while he might have had access to church finances, he had no apparent motive for harming Dorothy and couldn't have been involved in her disappearance without abandoning his very public responsibilities. Robert Carson, who owned the general store below Dorothy's apartment and had access to her living space, attracted attention when investigators learned about his mounting financial difficulties. Carson was 35 years old, married with 3 young children, and struggling to compete with larger stores in nearby towns. Bank records revealed that his business was operating on increasingly thin margins, and several suppliers had begun demanding immediate payment for merchandise. Investigators discovered that Carson had approached Dorothy several weeks before her disappearance, asking if the church might consider making a loan to help him modernize his store. Dorothy had reportedly been sympathetic, but explained that church funds couldn't be used for private business investments. Carson's wife Betty confirmed this conversation, adding that her husband had been desperate enough to try anything to save their store. However, Carson's alibi for Sunday evening was solid, supported by multiple witnesses who had seen him at a family gathering that lasted until well after midnight. Dr. Kenneth Morrison emerged as a more troubling suspect when investigators learned about his recent divorce and his mounting gambling debts. Morrison was 38 years old and had been struggling with what would later be recognized as a serious gambling addiction. His ex-wife had divorced him after discovering that he had been using money from their joint accounts to cover losses at poker games in the county seat. Morrison had been treating Dorothy for recurring headaches and had access to medications that could have been used to incapacitate someone without leaving obvious traces. More significantly, investigators discovered that Dorothy had been asking questions around town about Morrison's financial situation, suggesting she might have suspected him of some kind of impropriety. Morrison's alibi was less solid than the other suspects, as he claimed to have been home alone on Sunday evening, reading medical journals and preparing for Monday appointments. Frank Morrison, the church janitor and Dr. Morrison's younger brother, initially seemed like an unlikely suspect due to his reputation for simple honesty and his obvious devotion to the church. However, investigators learned that Frank had been acting strangely in the weeks before Dorothy's disappearance, arriving at work early and staying late, often when no church activities were scheduled. Frank was 29 years old, unmarried, and lived in a small house behind the church that came with his position. Several congregation members had noticed him watching Dorothy with unusual intensity during church services, though they had interpreted this as simple admiration rather than something more sinister. When questioned, Frank became defensive and evasive, unable to provide a clear account of his activities on Sunday evening. Thomas Morrison, the elderly former treasurer whom Dorothy had replaced, represented another potential source of conflict. Morrison was 73 years old and had been forced to step down from his position due to declining health and increasing confusion about financial matters. Family members later admitted that Morrison had been resentful about being replaced by someone so much younger, particularly a woman, despite his public endorsement of Dorothy's appointment. Investigators discovered that Morrison had been making critical comments about Dorothy's innovations in church financial management, suggesting that her methods were unnecessarily complicated and potentially inappropriate. Morrison's advanced age and obvious physical frailty made him an unlikely suspect for any crime requiring physical force, but investigators couldn't entirely rule out the possibility that he might have been involved in some kind of scheme to discredit Dorothy's work. The investigation eventually focused most heavily on Dr. Morrison, whose combination of gambling problems, medical knowledge, and questionable alibi made him the most likely suspect. However, despite extensive questioning and searches of his property, investigators found no physical evidence connecting him to Dorothy's disappearance. The case gradually grew cold as leads were exhausted, and the community's initial shock gave way to resignation and acceptance that Dorothy's fate might never be known. By the spring of 1954, active investigation into Dorothy's disappearance had essentially ended, though her case remained officially open. The file was transferred to a storage room in the county courthouse, where it would remain largely untouched for the next 6 decades, waiting for technology and techniques that didn't yet exist to reveal the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. District Attorney Margaret Chen presented a timeline that stretched back 6 decades, weaving together forensic evidence, witness testimony, and behavioral analysis. "This defendant has lived a lie for 61 years, Chen told the jury during opening statements. While the Morrison family grieved, while this community searched for answers, Harold Kemp sat in their church pews, counted their donations, and knew exactly what had happened to Dorothy Morrison. The irony was not lost on anyone present that Kemp had handled the very funds that would eventually help solve the case through modern forensic techniques. Dr. Sarah Williams, the forensic genealogist whose work had cracked the case, testified about the painstaking process of building family trees from degraded DNA samples. "We were working with genetic material that had been compromised by 6 decades of storage," she explained to the jury. "But advances in extraction techniques and database matching allowed us to identify familial connections that would have been impossible even 5 years ago. The technology that finally brought justice was beyond imagination when Dorothy Morrison died in 1962. Williams walked the jury through charts showing how distant cousin matches in public databases led investigators to narrow down potential suspects to just 3 individuals, with Kemp being the only one who had lived in Richmond during the relevant time period. Perhaps most damning was the testimony of church members who recalled Kemp's behavior in the weeks following Dorothy's murder. Martha Henderson, now 87, and one of the few surviving witnesses from that era, testified via video link about a conversation she'd had with Kemp just days after the body was discovered. "He seemed very interested in what the police were doing," Henderson recalled. "He kept asking if they had any suspects, if they'd found anything. At the time, I thought he was just concerned like the rest of us. Now I realize he was gathering intelligence." Henderson's voice shook as she described how Kemp had volunteered to help organize Dorothy's memorial service, insisting on personally handling the financial arrangements and reception details. The defense, led by veteran attorney Robert Caldwell, faced an almost impossible task. Caldwell argued that the DNA evidence, while compelling, came from samples that had been stored in less than ideal conditions for over 60 years. "We're asking this jury to convict a 91-year-old man based on genetic material that has passed through countless hands and storage facilities," Caldwell argued. "The margin for error, for contamination, for simple human mistake is enormous." He pointed out that Kemp had no prior criminal record, had lived an exemplary life in the community, and was being condemned for actions allegedly committed when he was barely 30 years old. Caldwell also challenged the circumstantial evidence linking Kemp to the crime scene. Yes, Mr. Kemp worked in the church office. Yes, he had access to areas where Mrs. Morrison conducted her duties. But so did dozens of other people. Access alone does not constitute guilt. The defense called character witnesses who spoke of Kemp's decades of community service, his mentorship of young people, his care for elderly parishioners. Pastor David Matthews, despite his personal anguish over the revelations, testified that Kemp had been instrumental in establishing the church's food bank and had personally delivered groceries to homebound members well into his 80s. But perhaps the most dramatic moment came when Harold Kemp himself took the stand in his own defense. Against his attorney's advice, the 91-year-old insisted on testifying. Dressed in a dark suit that hung loosely on his frail frame, Kemp spoke in a voice that was still strong despite his advanced age. "I did not kill Dorothy Morrison," he stated clearly, looking directly at the jury. "I would never harm anyone, especially not someone who trusted me, who worked alongside me in God's house." When Prosecutor Chen cross-examined him about his presence in the church that October evening, Kemp's answers became less certain. He claimed not to remember specific details from over 6 decades earlier, a response that seemed reasonable given his age, but which the prosecution suggested was convenient selective memory. The forensic evidence proved overwhelming. In addition to the DNA match from the original crime scene, investigators had discovered additional trace evidence during their recent search of Kemp's home. Fibers found in his basement matched samples taken from Dorothy's clothing, though the defense argued these could have been transferred innocently through their shared work environment. More problematic for Kemp was the discovery of a small wooden box hidden behind false backing in his bedroom closet. Inside were newspaper clippings about Dorothy's murder, church bulletins from her memorial service, and most disturbing of all, a small prayer book that Janet Morrison identified as belonging to her mother. "I gave that book to my mother for her birthday just 3 months before she died," Janet testified through tears. "She carried it with her everywhere. The police never found it with her things. I always wondered what had happened to it." The prayer book's margins contained handwritten notes in Dorothy's distinctive script, including a passage she had underlined in the weeks before her death. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The prosecution argued that Kemp had kept this macabre trophy for 61 years, unable to completely dispose of evidence that connected him to his victim. Expert testimony revealed that Kemp had displayed classic patterns of a successful psychopath who manages to hide in plain sight. Dr. Michael Torres, a criminal psychologist who had studied the case extensively, explained to the jury how certain personality types can compartmentalize their actions while maintaining functional public personas. "What we see with Mr. Kemp is not unusual among perpetrators who successfully evade justice for extended periods," Torres testified. "The ability to participate in memorial services for your victim, to console grieving family members, to even take leadership roles in investigating your own crime, requires a specific type of psychological makeup that we now understand much better than we did in 1962. Torres pointed to research showing that individuals with antisocial personality disorder often gravitate toward positions of trust and authority as cover for their activities. Mr. Kemp's role as church treasurer, his involvement in community organizations, his reputation for reliability and trustworthiness, all of these could serve as protective coloration, Torres explained. "The last person anyone would suspect is the man who volunteers to help, who shows up when others need assistance, who appears to embody community values." The trial also revealed disturbing details about Kemp's interactions with Dorothy's family over the decades. Investigation records showed that he had attended both of Janet Morrison's weddings, had sent condolence cards when her father died in 1978, and had even made several donations to the scholarship fund established in Dorothy's memory. "He watched us grieve," Janet said in her victim impact statement. "He came to family gatherings. He asked about our lives. He offered comfort when we needed it most. All while knowing exactly what had happened to my mother. That level of deception, of cruelty, goes beyond just the murder itself. He stole 61 years of truth from our family." Phone records subpoenaed during the investigation revealed that in recent years, as cold case reviews became more common and DNA technology improved, Kemp had made several calls to criminal defense attorneys, ostensibly asking about services for a friend who was worried about old cases being reopened. One attorney, Patricia Walsh, testified that Kemp had specifically asked about statutes of limitations for violent crimes and whether it was possible to prevent law enforcement from accessing decades-old evidence. The prosecution's closing argument was delivered by Assistant District Attorney James Park, who had worked on the case since the DNA breakthrough. "Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot give Dorothy Morrison her life back," Park told the jury. "We cannot undo 61 years of deception and manipulation, but we can finally speak the truth about what happened in that church office on October 23, 1962. The evidence is clear, it is overwhelming, and it demands justice." Park reminded the jury that modern science had accomplished what 1960s investigation techniques could not, but emphasized that the fundamental facts remained the same. A young woman died violently alone while simply trying to serve her community. Her killer has hidden among us for over 6 decades, protected by time, by technology limitations, and by his own calculated manipulations. Defense attorney Caldwell made a final plea for reasonable doubt, arguing that the passage of time made a fair trial impossible. "How do you defend against accusations from 61 years ago?" Caldwell asked the jury. "How do you prove your innocence when witnesses have died, when memories have faded, when evidence has been stored and transferred and potentially contaminated across 6 decades? This case asks you to convict an elderly man based on science that didn't exist when the crime occurred, and circumstantial evidence that has been interpreted through the lens of suspicion rather than presumption of innocence." The jury deliberated for 3 days. During that time, Richmond seemed to hold its collective breath. Local media reported on vigils held outside the courthouse, with some community members supporting the Morrison family, while others struggled to reconcile the Harold Kemp they had known with the man accused of murder. The church, where both Dorothy Morrison and Harold Kemp had served, held special prayer services, with Pastor Matthews leading the congregation, in seeking both justice and healing. On Thursday, November 18th, at 3:47 p.m., the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow observers listening via speakers in adjacent rooms. As Judge Patricia Hernandez read the verdict, the only sound was Janet Morrison's quiet sobbing. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Harold Edmund Kemp, guilty of murder in the first degree." The conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Though given Kemp's advanced age, it was essentially a death sentence. Kemp showed no visible reaction to the verdict. He sat quietly as Judge Hernandez scheduled sentencing for the following month, his hands folded in his lap, his expression unchanged. It was the same composed demeanor he had maintained throughout the trial, the same calm presence that had made him such an effective member of the community for over 6 decades. Even in defeat, Harold Kemp revealed nothing of his true self. The impact of the conviction extended far beyond the courthouse. Richmond Community Church faced the devastating realization that they had unknowingly harbored Dorothy Morrison's killer for over 60 years. Pastor Matthews announced his intention to retire early, stating that he needed time to process how someone he had trusted implicitly could have committed such a heinous act. The church voted to establish a new Dorothy Morrison Memorial Fund for victims' rights organizations, hoping to channel their shock and grief into positive action. For the Morrison family, the conviction brought a complex mix of relief, grief, and exhaustion. Janet Morrison, now 73, had spent most of her life wondering who had killed her mother. "I'm grateful for the technology that finally gave us answers," she said outside the courthouse after the verdict, "but I'm also heartbroken that my father died without knowing the truth, that my children grew up with this shadow over our family, that we invited our mother's killer to family celebrations for decades without knowing it." The case prompted a comprehensive review of other cold cases in the Richmond Police Department's files. Detective Ray Chen announced that the department would begin systematically re-examining unsolved murders from the 1960s and 1970s using modern forensic techniques. "We've learned that time doesn't heal all wounds," Chen said. "Sometimes it just allows them to fester. But we've also learned that science keeps advancing, and cases that seemed hopeless 20 years ago might be solvable today." Dr. Sarah Williams, the forensic genealogist whose work cracked the case, became a national spokesperson for the potential of genetic investigation in cold cases. She testified before a congressional subcommittee about the need for standardized evidence preservation procedures and increased funding for forensic laboratory improvements. The Dorothy Morrison case represents both the promise and the challenge of modern forensic science, Williams told lawmakers. "We have tools now that previous generations of investigators could never have imagined, but we need the resources and protocols to use them effectively." Harold Kemp died in prison on February 14, 2025, just 4 months after his conviction. He had maintained his innocence until the end, never providing any explanation for the evidence against him or any closure for Dorothy Morrison's family. His death certificate listed his age as 91 years old and cause of death as complications from pneumonia. He was cremated without ceremony, his ashes claimed by a distant nephew who had not spoken to him in decades. The resolution of Dorothy Morrison's murder became a touchstone case in discussions about justice delayed but not denied. Law enforcement agencies across the country began implementing new protocols for evidence preservation and cold case review. The Morrison case was featured in training materials for detectives, forensic scientists, and prosecutors, serving as both an example of investigative persistence and a reminder that some predators hide in plain sight for decades. Richmond slowly began to heal from the revelation that one of their most trusted community members had been living a lie for over 60 years. The church where Dorothy Morrison died and Harold Kemp served continued its mission, though with new leadership and a renewed commitment to transparency and accountability. The small park where Dorothy used to walk during her lunch breaks was renamed Dorothy Morrison Memorial Garden, with a plaque commemorating her life and service to the community. If you've been following this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Did anything about Harold Kemp's behavior over the decades stand out to you as suspicious? How do you think communities can better protect themselves from predators who hide behind respectable facades? Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into cases where modern science finally brings justice to families who have waited decades for answers. And share this video with anyone interested in true crime stories that show how persistence and technology can overcome even the most carefully constructed deceptions.